years ago, my best friend Chris and I decided to take a road trip to a secluded national park in Utah. We'd been planning this getaway for weeks, a chance to escape the grind, reconnect with nature, and enjoy a weekend under the stars. The park had breathtaking landscapes, towering red rock formations, vast canyons, and trails that stretched for miles. It wasn't completely remote, but it wasn't crowded either. It seemed perfect. The first night, everything went smoothly. A few other groups camped nearby, and the atmosphere was lively but peaceful. We grilled burgers, shared a few beers, and swapped stories with some campers we met. By the time the campfires were glowing low, we crawled into our tent, tired but content. The second night, however, was a completely different story. When we returned to the site after a day of hiking, the rangers informed us that everyone else had left. Chris and I were the only ones staying in the area. We thought that was awesome. We'd have the whole place to ourselves, a private experience with nature. But as the sun dipped behind the red cliffs, that excitement started to fade. The air felt heavier as twilight descended. The glow of the setting sun gave the rocks an eerie, almost alien hue. Chris laughed nervously and said, "Man, it feels like we walked into a movie set." He wasn't wrong. The silence felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. We kept close to the fire that night, roasting marshmallows and trying to distract ourselves with music and jokes. But as the hours dragged on, the unease only grew. It started with a distant crash, like a boulder tumbling down one of the cliffs. The sound echoed through the canyons, louder than anything we'd heard that day. Chris froze, flashlight in hand. "Probably just a rock slide," he said, though his voice shook. We scanned the darkness but saw nothing beyond the flickering firelight. Then came another crash, closer this time. The rhythm of the sounds wasn't random. It felt deliberate, calculated, like something was moving toward us. We doused the fire and ducked into the tent, zipping it tight. Sitting in the pitch black, we whispered theories to each other. Maybe it was an animal, or the wind knocking rocks loose. But deep down, we both knew better. The third crash came so close it seemed like whatever it was had reached the edge of our campsite. Chris grabbed the only weapon we had, a Swiss Army knife. "What good is that gonna do?" I hissed, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Then came the sound, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to pulse through the air. It wasn't just something we heard. We felt it deep in our chests, like the ground itself was alive. "You feel that?" Chris whispered. I nodded, too terrified to speak. It lasted for minutes, though it felt like hours. The tension was unbearable, and just as I thought it couldn't get any worse, we heard something else. A guttural, inhuman noise, like nothing I've ever encountered. It was loud, raw, and chilling, a sound that seemed to pierce through every rational thought I had. We stayed frozen in the tent, barely breathing, too terrified to even look outside. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as the hum grew, louder, almost unbearable, and then nothing. Silence. We must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the tent, sunlight streaming through the fabric. My phone was dead, though it had been fully charged the night before. Chris's was dead too. When we stepped outside, the campsite looked untouched, but it didn't feel right. The air was still heavy, and the silence was oppressive. We packed up in record time, neither of us saying much until we were back in the car. Only then did we admit how scared we'd been. Whatever was out there that night wasn't natural. Chris said he thought he saw something, just a shadow, a massive humanoid figure, but he couldn't describe it clearly. We still don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't think we want to. We haven't been back to that park or gone camping since. That night taught me that the wilderness holds secrets, some of which we're better off not knowing. Every year, my family upheld a tradition where we would retreat to the serene countryside of eastern Wyoming for a weekend in October. My Uncle Greg owned a sprawling 5-acre property there. The house was massive, featuring 6 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, enough to accommodate all of us comfortably. 2 of the rooms were reserved for the kids, one for me and my siblings and another for my 3 cousins. The remaining rooms were for the adults, including Uncle Greg and my parents. Uncle Greg was a passionate outdoorsman, known for his love of hunting and fishing. He often ventured across the country for his pursuits, even dragging my dad along on a few trips despite my dad's aversion to hunting. He was more of an animal lover than a sportsman. Part of the property extended into a dense forest, with the boundaries marked by bright orange paint on trees. Beyond that point lay endless county-owned woods, with no houses or cabins for miles. One chilly afternoon, my brother Luke and cousins, Ryan and Tommy, proposed an idea at lunch as our dads discussed hunting. We decided to camp in the woods that night. Our dads, already a few drinks deep, enthusiastically agreed. The moms, on the other hand, were skeptical but didn't outright forbid us. With the green light, Uncle Greg and my dad helped us pack up supplies and led us into the woods to set up camp. The forest was dark and dense, but after about 20 minutes, we reached a small clearing covered in soft, mossy grass that Uncle Greg referred to as deer beds. He assured us it was the perfect campsite and boasted about using it before. We set up a massive tent under their slightly tipsy guidance. They insisted we help with the setup, claiming it was a learning experience. Once the tent was ready, we stuffed it with sleeping bags and gear before heading back to the house to enjoy some daylight games before dinner. As night fell, our dads led us back to the campsite. Each of us carried a flashlight and extra blankets to combat the biting cold. I even brought along a deck of Uno cards to keep us entertained. Once we settled into the tent, the adults bid us goodnight and disappeared into the darkness, leaving us entirely alone in the woods. The clearing felt much more remote in the absence of daylight. No glow from the house was visible through the thick trees, and the silence was only interrupted by the occasional rustling of leaves. We huddled in a circle, our flashlights illuminating the inside of the tent, and played Uno to pass the time. Everything seemed fine until we heard the first scream. It was faint and distant, like a woman's cry for help. The 4 of us froze, exchanging nervous glances, trying to stay calm. I reminded everyone that foxes can produce screams that sound eerily human. This seemed to ease the tension, and we resumed our game. However, about 15 minutes later, the scream returned, closer, louder, and far more unsettling. Fear was palpable now, especially in Tommy, who clutched his flashlight tightly. I told everyone to turn off their lights and crawl into their sleeping bags. The plan was to stay quiet and hidden, though none of us dared to venture out of the tent. The thought of running through the dark forest, attracting attention to ourselves, was far more terrifying than staying put. Suddenly, we heard rapid footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves, heading straight for the tent. They stopped just outside, and before we could even react, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. It was deafening, unmistakably human, and it made the entire tent shake violently. Panic set in. Luke and Ryan shouted for everyone to run, and I quickly unzipped the tent. One by one, we bolted into the forest, flashlights in hand, sprinting as fast as we could toward the house. Every shadow felt like it was chasing us, every sound like it was closing in. That run was the most terrifying moment of my life. When we finally burst out of the woods and onto the property, screaming for help. The adults were already outside, alarmed by our cries. They listened in shock as we described the screams and the shaking tent. When I accused Uncle Greg or one of the older cousins of playing a prank, they assured us that everyone had been inside the house the whole time. Our dads grabbed rifles and ventured into the woods to investigate, but they returned empty-handed. No sign of anyone or anything was found. The next morning, we retrieved the tent and camping gear, and the experience became a story no one could forget. Unsurprisingly, that was the first and last time we ever camped in those woods. Even playing outside after dark became a thing of the past. To this day, I still don't know who or what was outside that tent. All I know is that I never want to find out. This happened in 2020. The world was shutting down because of the pandemic, and everyone was stuck indoors. Being an avid outdoorsman, I used it as an excuse to visit different wilderness areas and camp out. One of these trips took me to a remote, stream deep within Glacier Valley National Park in Montana. Without sharing too much about my personal life, let's just say my professional life took a turn in 2019. A misstep at work caused a significant financial loss for several people, leaving my reputation in shambles. The fallout forced me to change my apartment, get a new phone number, and eventually quit my job. For months, I endured relentless harassment through texts from unknown numbers, some even threatening. It felt like a storm that would never end. But then, just as suddenly, the harassment stopped, and I started to breathe easier. By 2020, I was unemployed and trying to find solace in nature. I drove 5 hours to Glacier Valley, parked my car, and started the hike to the secluded stream. The world was eerily quiet, both because of the lockdown and the harsh winter. A thin layer of snow covered the ground, crunching loudly beneath every step. After some effort, I reached the stream, still flowing despite the chill. The serene surroundings seemed like the perfect detox I desperately needed. I set up camp far off the trail to ensure solitude. With the tent pitched and firewood gathered, I cooked a simple meal, then settled down to read by the fire. Hours passed, and as darkness crept in, I lit a headlamp and rolled a cigarette to relax. Just as I started to unwind, my phone buzzed. Seeing texts from an unknown number made my heart skip a beat. The number was unfamiliar, with an area code I recognized as originating from New Hampshire. The first message read, "How's the camping trip going?" The next, "It's so peaceful here." And then, "I see why you chose this spot." My stomach dropped. These weren't random texts. Whoever this was, they were here, high and unnerved. I asked, "Who is this?" But no reply came. Anxiety clawed at me. I grabbed my handgun from my bag. It was more for peace of mind than anything. Leaving the fire burning, I crawled into my tent. Hours ticked by in an agonizing haze of paranoia. I tried to distract myself with videos on my phone, but every small sound outside made me freeze. Then came the next text. "It doesn't matter who I am anymore." My breath hitched as I typed back, "How do you know I'm camping?" Again, no reply. My unease grew unbearable. Silence enveloped the forest, save for the occasional snap of a branch in the wind. The fire outside began to die, its glow fading into embers. The woods were dead silent. But then, breaking the stillness, footsteps, crunching snow, deliberate and heavy, closing in on my tent. My grip tightened on the gun as I tried to stay calm. The steps stopped just feet away. Then, a brief flash of light illuminated the tent's fabric. A camera or flashlight, I couldn't tell which. Another text buzzed through, a photo of my tent. The caption, "Sleep tight." Panic surged through me. My mind raced as adrenaline kicked in. In a sudden burst of courage, I unzipped the tent, pointed my gun into the air, and fired 2 shots. The sound shattered the night's silence, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating into the darkness. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I stayed awake, gripping the gun tightly until the first rays of sunlight appeared. 5 years have passed since that night. The texts, the harassment, it all stopped after that trip. To this day, I wonder what might have happened had I not been armed, alone in those remote woods. If you enjoyed these real horror stories and want more chilling tales, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you the scariest stories from around the world. And if you've ever had a terrifying experience, share it in the comments. We'd love to hear it if you dare.